The great hall of Hartmore House had never been so quiet, and the quiet had teeth. Cecily Vane stood 12 feet from the man who had arrived 2 days ago calling himself Edmund Caverley, Duke of Hartmore, and she did not move. Behind her, the fire had burned low. Before her 4 guards, Briggs and his 3 men, forming a line between her and the door, and the man who was not the Duke stood in the center of the hall, with Gerald Caverley at his shoulder, and a half-signed document on the table beside him. She had been a fixture in this house for 7 years. She had polished its silver by candlelight, and managed its morning room accounts when the previous Duchess grew too ill to do so. She had watched its master walk the gallery at midnight when grief would not give him rest. She knew every room's sound and every person's step, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the great hall when something was wrong. "Everything was wrong, Miss Vane," Gerald said. His voice was pleasant, in the manner of a man who has never needed force because other instruments have always sufficed. "It is nearly 11 at night. This is not the hour." "That is not the Duke," she said. She addressed the guards. She looked at Briggs, whose face had gone still in the particular way of a man receiving instructions his conscience has reservations about following. "She is no one of consequence," Gerald said, the pleasantness sharpening at its edges. "See her to her room." Briggs took a step toward her. "I can prove it," Cecily said. "Give me until morning. By morning, I can lay before you evidence sufficient to stop every document on that table and bring a magistrate to this hall. Give me until morning, or whatever you do here tonight cannot be undone, and you will have done it." The fire gave a single low crack. The man who was not the Duke looked at her for the first time with something other than dismissal, and what she saw on his face was not indifference. It was calculation. It was the look of a man assessing whether a small problem might yet become a large one. She held his gaze. "Lock her below," Gerald said. Briggs's hand closed on her arm. She did not resist. She walked with him toward the servants' stair, and she did not let herself think about the cold or the dark or the hours between now and dawn, because if she began to think about those things, she would not be able to stop. She had bought the night. She did not yet know if the night would be enough. Her father had come to Hartmore as an understeward when Cecily was 15, the year after her mother died, and the year before his own health began its long, gradual failure. He had served Edmund Caverley's father faithfully for 6 years before the old Duke died, and the new Duke had retained him out of respect for that service rather than any pressing need. She remembered the day he had informed her father of his continued employment. Her father had told her about it that evening, standing in the small room they shared in the East Wing, his voice careful and level in the way of a man who does not permit himself to show relief, because he has learned that relief, felt too soon, invites disaster. The Duke, he had said, had looked him in the eye when he said it, as though the matter required looking a man in the eye. Her father had found this worthy of remark because it was not what he had come to expect from the peerage, and the fact that he found it worthy of remark had told Cecily something about the Duke before she had ever been in the same room with him. When her father passed, the household had assembled in the chapel without being asked. Edmund himself had stood at the back and had not spoken, and had not needed to. He was that sort of man. She had stayed on because Lady Hartmore required a companion, and she had stayed on after Lady Hartmore died because she did not know where else to go. And gradually the house had made room for her in the way that large old houses make room for those who prove themselves useful without requiring recognition. She organized the linen closets. She managed the correspondence the housekeeper could not decipher. She read to the Duke's young ward when the child had fever, and she ordered the coal when the steward forgot. And she did these things because they needed doing, and not because anyone would remark on them. The ward, a boy of 9 named Peter, who was the orphaned son of Edmund's younger brother, had once told her that she was the only person in the house who did not speak to him as though he were about to break. She had accepted this observation as a fair one and had returned to the book they were reading, which was a natural history of the Yorkshire moors, and she had heard him say it, only later, privately, when she had finished the chapter, and set the book down and walked to her own room and thought about it, by the window in the dark. He had not meant to give her anything. He had simply said the true thing because he was 9 and did not yet know there were other options. To the household's formal accounting, she was barely a name, a fixture, not a person. The words had been said to her directly, by the previous Duchess's sister on the occasion of that lady's first and only visit, spoken within Cecily's hearing, with the casual cruelty available only to those who have never considered whether a room's other occupants might be listening. She had not wept. She had gone to the library and found a volume on estate drainage that required annotating and had annotated it. And in the morning she had risen early and set the fires, and no one had been any the wiser for what had moved through her in the dark. 7 years of that had given her something, though. 7 years had given her the house. She knew it the way she knew her own breathing. Not by thought, but by a kind of accumulated attention she had not chosen to give and could not have withheld. She knew which rooms held cold air in the corners because the north-facing windows had never been properly sealed. She knew which of the kitchen staff came in before 5 in the mornings, and which of the footmen had a habit of pausing on the main landing before beginning his rounds, and she knew the smell of the library at dusk when the fire had been burning for an hour, and the leather of the chair backs and the old paper of the books had all reached the same warm temperature, and the rooms smelled in a way she had never told anyone, like the only thing she would call home. She knew the sound the third stair made when the weight fell on its left side. She knew which footman carried a letter with his elbow angled out and which one tucked it against his ribs. She knew that he, when he was troubled, would walk to the window in whatever room he occupied and stand with his right hand at his left breast pocket, touching the small portrait miniature he carried there, not pressing it, not drawing it out, simply resting his fingers against the shape of it. She had never asked what it was. She did not need to ask. She had seen the grave in the east garden, tended separately from the others, and she had seen his face when he passed it on his morning walks, and she had understood. The man in the great hall had not touched his pocket once. Not once in 2 days. In a dozen rooms under circumstances that would have sent any genuinely troubled man's hand toward whatever small anchor he carried. He had poured wine with his left hand when the Duke was right-handed. He had called the housekeeper by her first name when the Duke had not used her Christian name in 15 years of service. He had stood at the wrong fireplace, not the one Edmund stood at, the one with the family crest worked into the mantel, and the particular chair angled left that any man who had spent his evenings there for 30 years would have sought without thinking. He had not sought it. He had stood at the opposite hearth, the one reserved for guests, and he had been comfortable there, and his comfort was the most damning thing she had witnessed. Gerald Caverley had arrived the same day as the man he called his cousin, and their arrival together, at an hour when the real Edmund had been expected on the road from London 3 days hence, had struck her as irregular enough to lodge itself beneath her breastbone where small wrongnesses lived before they became large ones. She had not spoken, she had watched. She had watched the way a woman watches, when she knows that speaking too early means not being heard at all. Gerald was a thin, precise man of 50, with the particular confidence of someone who has spent decades being told he was nearly important. He was the Duke's third cousin twice removed, and he had visited Hartmore exactly 4 times in the 7 years Cicely had been here. He knew the house well enough to navigate it without assistance, and not well enough to love it. There was a difference she had found between the two. Gerald walked through Hartmore as though passing through a place he intended to inhabit. Edmund walked through it as though accounting for something he was responsible for maintaining. The distinction was not one she could have pointed to in a single gesture. It was accumulated across 1,000 small decisions of direction and pace and attention that a man makes as he moves through rooms, and she had watched enough of both of them to know the difference in her blood. The man who arrived with Gerald had Edmund's height and Edmund's coloring, and had been dressed with evident care, in clothes that fit well enough to suggest someone had measured him. From 20 feet away in poor light, with no reason to look closely, he was convincing. Cecily had reason to look closely. She had spent 7 years in rooms with the real man, and the body before her moved with the studied deliberateness of a performance, not the unconscious economy of someone at ease in his own proportions. His hands, when he accepted a glass of wine at the first evening's dinner, were not right. Not wrong in any way she could name in words. Wrong in the way a familiar piece of music is, wrong when a note is played at the correct pitch, but with the wrong duration. And only those who know the piece well enough to feel it in the chest before the ear catches it notice the error at all. He reached for the wine with his left hand. Edmund had broken 2 bones in his left hand in a riding accident 4 years ago, and had favored his right ever since, not obviously, not as a pronounced difficulty, but as a preference that had set itself into his body's habits over years, until it was simply how he moved through the world. She had set down her own glass, very carefully, and said nothing. He had produced the documents on the first evening, which was faster than she would have expected if the business were legitimate, and the documents concerned the mortgaged properties along the valley, which she had helped the steward organize the previous spring, and whose total encumbrance she knew to the nearest £50. The transfers, if signed, would convey those properties in trust to a London firm she did not recognize, with a schedule of payments that would effectively remove them from the Calverley estate within 18 months. She had asked Mrs. Pelham whether the Duke had spoken of selling the valley properties. Mrs. Pelham had said that he had not. Mrs. Pelham had also said that it was not their place to remark on His Grace's business affairs. Cecily had looked at the senior housekeeper for a long moment, the way you look at a woman who has been in a great house for 30 years and knows exactly what she is not saying. "If you had a concern," Cecily had said carefully, "who would you bring it to?" Mrs. Pelham had been quiet for several seconds. "I have had no cause to form such a concern," she had said, and her hands had been very still in her lap, and that stillness had told Cecily everything she needed. Mrs. Pelham was not a woman who permitted herself to be disturbed. She had managed Hartmore through the death of the old Duke and the transition to the new one, through Lady Hartmore's illness and death and the household's subsequent reorganization, through 2 difficult winters, when the roof had required emergency repair and the footmen had staged a quiet protest about their wages. She was the house's interior architecture, in the same way that the Stostone walls were its exterior one, solid, load-bearing, and not given to movement. Cecily had learned to read her stillness the way she had learned to read the house's other signals. A hand folded in the lap that had not been in the lap a moment before was not peace. It was resolution. She left Mrs. Price Pelham and went to her room and sat at the small writing table by the window, and thought for a long time about what she was about to do. She thought about it the way you think about a thing when you have already decided and are only giving the decision the respect of a deliberate interval before acting on it. She knew exactly what she would put in the letter to Sir Alden Croft. She knew approximately what would happen to her when she walked into the great hall and spoke. She was not stupid about the order of events that would follow her statement. She thought about her father standing in the servants' hall when the new Duke told him his position was retained. She thought about Edmund at the back of the chapel, not speaking, not needing to. She wrote the letter. She sealed it. She went to find Thomas. That evening, in the hour before Cecily had walked into the great hall and spoken the words that had landed her in the servants' cellar, she had found the youngest footman, a boy of 16, named Thomas, who had come to Hartmore from the village, and whose family she knew by name. And she had pressed the sealed letter into his hand and told him to ride to the magistrate's house in Harrogate and put it into the magistrate's hands before morning. She had told him to go by the East Lane. She had told him not to stop. She did not know if he had gone. She did not know if he had been seen. She was sitting on the cellar floor in the cold and the dark, with her back against the stone wall, and she was listening to the sound of January pressing against the house from outside. And she was thinking about the miniature. There was a great deal of time to think about it. The cold came up through the stone. In stages. First, at her feet, then at her knees, then settling along her back and shoulders like a second garment, placed over the first. She had no candle. She had been put down here with nothing but the knowledge she carried, which was the only thing they could not take from her without effort, and which was also, she reminded herself, the only thing she had ever primarily relied upon. She had been afraid of the dark as a child. Her father had cured this, Not by telling her there was nothing to fear, which was untrue and which she would have recognized as untrue, but by sitting with her in dark rooms until she became accustomed to what she could learn in them. You can hear more in the dark, he had told her. You can feel the temperature of the air and the movement in it, and the size of the space you are in if you sit still long enough. The dark is not nothing. It is full of information. You simply have to wait until your other senses organize themselves. She waited. The house above her was not silent. She could hear the measured tread of 2 guards in the corridor overhead, the occasional low exchange of voices, whose words she could not resolve into meaning, and once, faintly, what might have been Gerald walking from the hall toward the study with the document table following in his wake. That sound, she told herself, was productive fear. That sound told her there was still time. The document had not been signed before she had been brought down here. She had seen it on the table unsigned, and Gerald had been too preoccupied with her removal to return to it immediately. The window of the East Lodge was small. She did not know whether Edmund had been able to make himself heard through it, or whether the 2 men Gerald had left there were the sort of men who responded to a lord's authority even when it complicated their employment. She did not know whether Thomas had found the lodge before finding the magistrate, or after, or at all. She knew that she had done everything she could do from the outside of a locked door. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone and felt the texture of it under her fingers. The particular grain of this particular Yorkshire stone that she had never in 7 years thought about, and that she was thinking about now with a kind of absolute detailed attention, and she thought about it plainly. If he comes, if he is still on the estate, and if Thomas found the lodge, and if Croft received the letter and rode through the night, which he would, because he had been the old Duke's friend and had never been indifferent to the Caverley estate's welfare, if all of that, then Edmund walks in, and the miniature is produced, and there is a moment when the world is asked to choose between the evidence of its own senses and Gerald's very confident assertions, and it chooses the former. She had been waiting for the world to do that for a long time, on a smaller scale. She had some practice at holding the faith that it might. Edmund had shown it to her once. He had not meant to. She had come into the library in the early evening, more than 2 years ago now, in the weeks after his wife had died, and the house had taken on the particular weight of a place where something large has been lost, and no one yet knows how to arrange themselves around its absence. There was a quality to the air in Hartmoor during that time that she had never experienced in any other context, a thickness, as though grief occupied physical space and displaced what had previously been there. The household spoke in lower registers than usual. The footmen set things down more carefully. Even the fires seemed to burn with less ambition than they had the previous winter, and she had found herself tending them more often as though the house needed the additional attention. She had come for the account ledger she had left on the window table. She had not known he was there. He had been sitting at the far end of the room with his back to the door, and by the time she registered him she was already inside, and the light from his single candle had caught the miniature he held open in his palm. She had seen the face in the painting. A young woman, dark-haired, painted in 3/4 view, with an expression that was not quite smiling, as though the painter had caught her at the moment just before a smile arrived, the moment of anticipation rather than the thing itself. She had seen his face above it, still in the way of a man who has gone somewhere private inside himself, and forgotten he has a body. His shoulders had none of their customary self-management. He had looked in that particular suspension like a man who was doing the only thing left available to him, which was simply to continue existing in the vicinity of something he had loved and lost. She had retreated without sound. She did not think he ever knew she had been there. But she had seen the miniature, the oval gilt frame with the small chip at the upper right corner, the woman's face. She had carried that image in her memory for 2 years, the way you carry a thing you had no right to see and cannot put down, because the moment had offered her something she had not expected. Not the Duke managing his household, not the Duke receiving guests, not the Duke reviewing accounts with the careful authority of a man who has been trained since childhood to manage a great deal at once, but simply a man. at the far end of a room, holding something small that could not talk back to him. She had thought about that image more often than was wise. The man in the great hall did not have it. She had looked at his chest in every room, in every angle of light. The coat he wore was correct. The posture was studied and close. The pocket was flat. Either he had stopped carrying the miniature in the 2 years since she had last seen it, in which case she had no proof, and the document would be signed and the estate would be lost, or the man in the great hall was not the Duke, and he was somewhere on this estate or near it, and she would have until dawn to prove the one or find the other. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone floor. She breathed. The dark was not absolute. There was a line of faint orange beneath the cellar door, the tallow lamp Briggs had left at the top of the servants' stair. Horror! She could hear very faintly the movement of the house above her, the great hall's fire being banked, the scrape of the document table being settled. If you are still in the night with her wondering whether a woman who has spent 7 years being no one of consequence can prove a thing before morning breaks, let her remind you of something. She has never needed them to see her. She has only ever needed to see clearly herself. A sound at the door. Soft, tentative. The sound of something very small being scraped across stone at floor level. She pressed her face close to the gap. Miss Vane, a whisper. A girl's voice. Molly, the kitchen maid, who was 17 and had a mother in the village, and had once told Cecily in the frank way of girls who have not yet learned to be otherwise, that she thought Cecily was the cleverest person in the house. I can't get the door. I tried the key. Mr. Briggs took the right one. It's all right, Molly. He told the guards you were no one of consequence. The anger in the girl's voice was very young and very real. Mr. Briggs said it. He said, Mr. Reg. Gerald said it. He said there was no point in watching you close. I know. Mrs. Pelham went upstairs. Cecily's hand went still against the door. When? 1/4 of an hour past. She wouldn't say why. She had a candle and she was very quick. The miniature. She had not told Mrs. Pelham about the miniature. She had asked only whether there was a concern. Mrs. Gulf. Pelham had been in this house for 30 years, and she knew what she knew. And sometimes a woman who cannot speak her fear directly will act on it in the direction she has been pointed. Molly, Cecily said, go to the window of the front hall. If you see a rider coming from the east lane, come back and tell me. Yes, miss. And Molly. Thank you. The whisper of the girl's feet retreating, the silence returning, less absolute than before. Cecily sat back down on the cold floor and she waited, and she did not let herself count the hours. What came next did not arrive the way she had imagined it, because things never do. She heard the front door first. Then voices, more than she expected, overlapping and sharp. Then Briggs's voice raised, in a way that was not the voice of a man comfortable with the authority he was performing. Then Gerald's voice, higher and faster than usual. Then a silence that was not the silence of a house at rest, but the silence of a room in which many people have stopped speaking. At once, the cellar door opened. Briggs stood at the top of the stair with a lamp, and an expression she could not entirely read. He said nothing. He stepped aside. She went up. The great hall was full of people. The household had come, or much of it. Mrs. Thresh. Pelham stood at the far left wall with her hands folded before her, and a small gilt-framed oval object in her right hand. 2 men she did not recognize in traveling coats stained with the road. Sir Alden Croft, white-haired and solid, who had apparently arrived 20 minutes ago, and had wasted none of them. 3 additional riders who must have come with him. Gerald standing at the center of the hall with a paper in his hand that he no longer seemed certain what to do with. And Edmund. She knew him before she had finished crossing the threshold, because she had always known him the way you know a house, not by examining it, but by having lived inside it, until its proportions are in your body. He was disheveled in a way she had never seen him disheveled, the coat wrong, the cravat absent, a bruise along the left jaw that had not been there the last time she had seen him. He stood at the far end of the hall and he was speaking to Croft in a voice too low for her to make out from the stair. The man who had been posing as the Duke was being quietly flanked by two of Croft's men near the document table. He had stopped performing composure. Mrs. Pelham crossed to Cecily and placed the miniature in her hands. The oval gilt frame, the chip at the upper right corner, the woman's face in three-quarter view, the expression that was not quite smiling. "I thought," Mrs. Pelham said, "that it ought to be where someone could account for it." Cecily closed her fingers around it. Gerald was talking at Croft, in the register of a man, explaining why what has happened is not what it appears to be. And Croft was looking at him with the patient, complete inattention of a man who has been a magistrate for 22 years and has learned exactly when to stop listening. It was Edmund who saw her first. She was not prepared for the way he crossed the room. He had always been deliberate in his movements, the particular economy of a large man who has never needed to hurry because things have generally waited for him. He was not slow now. He was crossing toward her with 3 strides of purpose that silenced the nearest cluster of conversation, simply by proximity, and he stopped 2 feet from her, and he looked at her face in a way that was not the way he had ever looked at her in 7 years of shared rooms. He looked at her as though she were the specific person he had been looking for. "Croft tells me you sent the letter," he said. "Yes, Your Grace Thomas. Rode through the night." "I asked him to." He was quiet for a moment. The bruise on his jaw was darker up close. His coat had mud at one shoulder, and his right hand had a cut across the knuckles. She did not wish to examine for fear of what it would do to her composure. "They had me at the East Lodge," he said. "Gerald's men. 3 days I was told the house had been informed I was delayed by the roads. No one told us anything," she said. "Gerald told us you had arrived." Something moved in his face at that. Not the composed management she was accustomed to seeing from him, the careful arrangement of a man who has learned to deliver himself in measured doses. Something that moved faster than management. "You knew immediately," he said. "Not immediately. I watched first." "What gave it away?" She looked down at the miniature in her hand. She looked up at him. "You never leave it," she said. "In all the time I have been here, even at dinner. Even when you are perfectly at ease, your hand goes to your left pocket. It was not a conscious thing, I think. It was constant." His right hand, which had been at his side, moved, not toward his pocket, toward her. He stopped it before it arrived, but she felt the arrest of it, the deliberate choice not to complete the motion, and the warmth that came up in her throat had nothing to do with the fire that someone had rebuilt behind her. "He did not have it," Edmund said. "No, because I had it." She nodded. He reached into his left breast pocket and drew out the miniature's twin. Not its twin, the same. He had kept it at the lodge. His hand had known where it was, even in captivity. He looked at the one she held and then at the one in his own palm, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Croft was managing Gerald at the other end of the hall with brisk professional efficiency, and the imposter Fenwick had been separated from the document table and was being addressed by 2 of Croft's men in terms she could not hear but whose substance she could imagine, and the household stood in small clusters watching all of it, with the particular alert quietness of people witnessing something they will describe to their grandchildren. Edmund turned toward the hall at large. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "This woman is Hartmore," he said. "Without her, you would have lost it." The room did not erupt. It was not that kind of room in that kind of moment. She felt the quality of the silence shift around the words, felt it change in the way a room changes when a window is opened in winter, and the cold, real air comes in and displaces the stale warmth that has been passing for sufficient. She felt Briggs behind her, settle in some way she could identify only as a man accepting a reckoning. She felt Mrs. Pelham beside her press her hand once and release it. She felt Edmund looking at her, and she could not make herself look away. If you have stayed this far, you know what she did not yet know, was that this was not the end of anything. It was only the end of the night. In the weeks that followed, Gerald was bound over for examination, and the impostor Fenwick was taken to York, and the documents were given to Croft to be reviewed for whatever legal proceeding would follow. The Valley properties remained in the Caverley estate. The household returned gradually to its rhythms, though some of the rhythms were different now, because a house that has been through what Hartmore had been through in those 3 days does not simply resume its former shape. Edmund remained. That in itself was different. He had spent the previous 2 years between London and the estate in a pattern that kept him at Hartmore for weeks at a time, and then drew him away again, and the intervals had been long enough that the house had learned to manage his absence as a condition. Now he managed the estate from the library, and from the study, and from the gallery in the evenings, and from the east garden on clear afternoons, and the house arranged itself around his presence instead. He did not say anything to her directly for almost 3 weeks. He looked at her when she did not expect it. He asked her questions about the household accounts that he had not previously thought to ask her, questions that were not about the accounts precisely, and she answered them precisely, because it was what she knew how to do. On a Tuesday evening in late February, she was in the library returning a volume of estate correspondence to its place when she heard him come in. She did not turn. She finished sliding the volume into its correct position on the shelf, and she stood with her back to the room. "Cicely," he said, her given name. In his voice the first time. She turned. He was standing at the center of the room. Not at his customary window. Not at the fireplace. Not in the chair. That was his by long habit. At the center, equidistant from everything. As though he had placed himself deliberately somewhere that was not a retreat. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You owe me nothing, Your Grace. I disagree." He moved to the chair then, not sitting, but resting his hand on its back. "I would like to tell you about the miniature, if you are willing to hear it." She was. She had always been. He told her about his wife, whose name had been Frances, and who had come to Hartmore at 19, and learned the house the way Cecily had learned it, by doing rather than by being shown, by caring for its details rather than commanding others to care. She had been 23 when she died. He had carried the miniature because he had thought, for a time, that he owed it to her memory not to put it down. "And now," Cecily said, "now I carry it, because it is hers, and she was worth carrying." His voice was even. It was the voice of a man who has grieved past the place where grief requires performance. "Not because I cannot sit it down, I can." She looked at him. "She would have liked you," he said. "That is not a small thing to say." She was not indiscriminate in her liking. Cecily's hands were folded before her. She could feel her pulse in her wrists in the way that told her she was either frightened or the opposite of frightened, and she was doing her best to be as honest with herself as she had always been with everything else. "You have been in this house for 7 years, he said, "and I did not see you. I knew you were here. I knew your name and your father's name, and that you ordered the coal when Michelson forgot, and that you sat with Frances in the last weeks when she found sleep difficult. I knew all of that. I did not see you. You were grieving. That is a reason. It is not an absolution." He looked at her steadily. "I am looking now, if you will permit it." She thought of the cellar floor, and the dark, and the cold weight of January pressing through the stones. She thought of the miniature in her hand, and the quality of attention it had taken to notice what 7 years of living in a house had given her to know. She thought of the way he had crossed the room in 3 strides, and looked at her as though she were the specific person he had been looking for. She had spent 7 years being no one of consequence. She understood, in this moment, that the verdict had never been accurate. It had simply been the verdict of people who had not been looking. He was looking. "I will permit it," she said. He did not move toward her. He was not a man who rushed past the wait of a moment. His hand was still on the back of the chair, and the fire behind him threw its warm light across the familiar room. And the January dark beyond the library window had the clean, cold quality of a night that has finished doing what it came to do. Later, she would not be able to say exactly how long they stood there before he reached out and touched the back of her hand very lightly, 2 fingers only, with all the intention in the world. Her breath went out. His did too. The fire settled. He drew the miniature from his pocket. He set it on the writing table between them, face up, Francis's painted gaze at the ceiling. "She is still here," he said. "I would not ask her not to be." "I know," Cecily said. "I would not ask it either." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment, with the fire behind him and the cold outside and the house settling around them. This house she had learned by heart, without knowing she was learning it for any purpose other than love of the thing itself. "Cecily," he said again, as though testing how the word fit inside the room they were standing in. It fit! Outside, snow had begun to fall without either of them noticing, soft and steady on the east garden's frozen ground, covering the small grave there as it covered everything else, gently and without distinguishing between what was old and what was new, what was lost and what had at the end of a very long night been found. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's particular kind of courage moved you, leave a word in the comments, and find the next story waiting for you here.